with your pencil and paper, what I want you to do is we're going to analyze the absolute basic elements of marks on a paper. So the number one element of drawing is line. Now, when we think of lines, what do we think of? And I want to show you here. We're going to draw a vertical line, and I want you to kind of maybe keep a pattern on your paper. So we're going to use several pages, but you can work alongside with me. And what I'm going to do here, different from what you see on the image on screen, is I'm going to place my vertical line, and we all know what a vertical line is, right here to this edge. I'm going to do a horizontal line right next to it. I'm going to work, and I'm going to draw a diagonal line and a curved line. Now, when you stop and think about it, is there any other type of line or mark making that you can come up with? Because everything we do has a little bit of either vertical, horizontal, diagonal, or curve. And there are variations of them. So we always go to the absolute basic fundamental marks that we can come up with. These are it. Now, from here, we would move to combinations of lines. So if I put two vertical lines parallel to each other, and then I connect them with a horizontal line at the top, I'm going to switch over just very quickly so you can see a little bit better to a colored pencil here. So you could see, because I was using an HB pencil, so now hopefully you could see them a little bit better with today's lighting. There we are. So from here we have two vertical lines, and with the combination I'm going to connect them with two smaller horizontal lines. So this is vocabulary that we absolutely need to be fluent in. We have our lines, we have the combination of lines, and now we have shapes. So from line, we go to shape. Now we have a rectangle. Here, I'm going to combine horizontal and vertical lines of the same size, and we have a square. And I know for some of you this seems like, well, this is too elementary. We are going all the way back just to see the steps that are going to get us to where we want to go today. Next, I'm going to draw a diagonal line. And now we're thinking about angles. So this one is I would say a 30-degree from vertical. And the opposite, sort of a symmetrical diagonal line. Also connected by, now I have choices here. Horizontal. How about curve? And how curve can I make this line? So all these options we call them variables. We begin to combine them. Next, I'm going to complete the curve and form a circle. Now, apologies, I might have gone just a little ahead. Let's just make it simple, all the way through. I always get ahead of myself. And a triangle, because we want to recognize these as the absolute basic shapes. So we have the basic fundamental lines, once again, vertical, horizontal, diagonal, curve, that give us the absolute basic shapes. Now shapes, as you notice, are two-dimensional. We only read height, width, and the goal is going to be to add a couple more lines. And now I begin to see verticals. And what used to be horizontals are going to become not just lines, but shapes. So it's going to become an ellipse made out of curves. That curves way more right at the edges. And it's going to give me a cylinder. So now we have from line to shape to form. We're going to add one more. And I'm going to do it in a different way if you want to follow me here. I'm going to draw one line, not too close to this form and not too far out here, just to keep it within this frame, I'm going to draw one right in the middle, a vertical line, to create what would be the form that develops from the square into a cube. And now I'm going to add diagonal lines that are going this direction, and they're going to be parallel. That's the key. And I'm going to connect them at a certain distance with another vertical. I'm going to add the same type of angle in the opposite direction, also in diagonal. The key is that they are parallel. And then I'm going to connect them with another vertical. Now I have this line here, this diagonal, and by logic, I should replicate it here, making it parallel to this one. So I could kind of trace it slowly to see if I'm close, making it a little longer or shorter. And then we look at this one here. This diagonal should have a parallel that replicates here. So I do that. And I could kind of begin very lightly until I got somewhat of a visual for me to just finish it up. So there's our cube. And notice that we could see 3 sides of the cube, which is important. Here, we're going to go to, this is where I got a little ahead of myself. From the triangle, we could turn this into a pyramid. If we wanted to, that would be another option for a form. But we want to continue with the basic shapes. It's going to be a cone. Now the cone, because we can't see the back side of it, we could kind of dot a line. If you could see that, I'm going to make it just a little bit darker. So I'm dotting the line to give us that sensation of seeing translucent, like transparent, the shape of a cone, the base of it. And it's another ellipse. And then finally, we have the circle that, with not necessarily a straight line, but more of a curve, follows the roundness of the sphere as almost an equator. And a parallel. There we go. So, very simply, we went from line to shape to form. What would come next? And how all these are the elements of art, the foundations of it. Making sure we could construct anything we want based on these fundamental elements. So having the line understanding shapes to forms, you can construct anything you can think of with variations of it. What comes next would obviously be light. And that's what we're going to look at today. So let's go ahead and have a little fun with this one here. What we're going to do is we're going to replicate. So double up your drawing here. And as I just practice drawing a cylinder, I'm going to pick a direction where my light is coming from, and I could see that, where I could then just add a little bit of shadow. And you could do this so simple. I want to show you how. And for that, I'm going to zoom in just a little bit. So I want to keep this, I don't want to start coloring in. You could do this just by adding lines. So here I'm adding vertical lines, but they're really, really close to each other. And I'm adding a little more pressure. And as I begin to lower my pressure and begin to give a little bit of distance to them, notice that the gap between the lines becomes larger and larger. I hope you could see that easily. If not, I'm going to give you a closer look. Adding lines. And I could have done my shadows here. in the same way, but just a little more pressure and putting them just closer. So now I'm dealing with the value of the line. And what does that mean, the value of the line? It means whether it's darker or lighter. I'm also dealing with the gauge of the line. Don't worry about all these terminologies. It's just, hopefully it's making sense. The gauge of the line is the thickness or thinness of the line. And I'm also dealing with the distance between the lines, the space between them. Let's go ahead and move to the next one. And we'll do that very simply again, starting with the diagonal. I'm sorry, our vertical, our parallel diagonals, connecting our vertical. And do not worry if you're not shapes. I'm sure everybody can draw a square, and we're doing our best, you know, to have them look like we use the ruler. That's part of the practice, and it is a practice for every level. No matter what level you are in, you are going to find these type of exercises pushing your level of skill further and further until you actually could be satisfied with perfection. And that's not what it's about. Even if your cube is looking a little, call it dicey, irregular, fine. It's about understanding parallel lines and how to build from a shape to a solid to a form. And the key here, again, is going to be to add some lines. So these I'm going to give a couple, let's call it 2 millimeters of space in between with a little bit of lightness. And on this side, I could do several things. I could do the same pattern with a little more pressure, adding a little more value, or I could double it. So notice that I did a first pass with lines, and then I'm just going to go over that same space with a second pass of lines. And all of a sudden, we have a form in light. And I'm just going to add a little bit of cast shadow. So I'm adding a few lines right here at the bottom. Like I said, not to worry. The whole point of this is for you to visualize an object in space. Does it make sense now? And I'm pretty sure it will if you're following these very simple rules. Let's go to our cone. We're going to repeat. We could play with it. We can make it a little more acute or a little flatter, a little more rounder at the bottom. So I'm just going to do the bottom curve. I'm not going to do the back little dotted line that I did to hint at the base. And I'm going to repeat the same. So now I'm looking at lines, and these are parallel to my side here. But as I follow the surface of the cone, I'm always starting at the top, the center. And as I move around it, I begin to add more space between the lines. So notice that they're not completely parallel to each other. And as they get softer and more spaced, we will have something like this. So it's figuring out also the direction of the line, as we did here. So now we're dealing with direction and angle. And I'm just going to add a little triangle shape here. Few, we can even count them, 6, 7 lines to hint at that cast shadow there. And finally, we're going to do our sphere. So from a circle, from a curved line to a circle to a ball, I'm just going to go right back to here. I'm going to avoid those lines. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to select my light direction again. And I'm just going to do that equator, but I'm going to do it kind of at an angle. Let's call it a diagonal curve sort of setup here, which would infer that the light is coming this way. And that would give me somewhat of a cast shadow like this, which will be another ellipse on the surface. And very easily, I'm going to follow the direction of the light. So if I see the light coming this way, I want my lines to also kind of cast our shadow that way as well. It helps it gives it a little more realism. And you'll see that in our next exercise. And I could just actually leave it as simple as that. But I want to actually reinforce. So I'm going to cross over. So it's a little bit of cross hatching. What does that mean? First line was like this. My second pass, I'm going to angle it just a little bit, creating sort of a mesh, what's called a cross hatch. And the cross, they almost look like letter X's. So if you were to just take one, it's a very, very skinny, sharp X, what you're looking for. And I'm going to actually make it a little bit shorter type of line, giving me a little extra. Notice how it gives you a little bit of extra shadow right here. And there we have it. So, fully finished page. We go from the absolute basic fundamentals of mark making. And if you need to label them, it's always great to have line, shape, form. And obviously this is also a form, but our focus was on, believe it or not, two things: light and space. Because and I'm going to put space kind of in parentheses, because as you add light, it places the object or the form in space somehow. If I were to do just completely black all around this sphere here, we probably would see it as a moon. But because it has a cast shadow, I could actually see it on the surface. So now it's a ball on a table. So it's all of these things working together to help us create stronger drawings at every level. But always, always, always anchoring at the fundamentals. Okay, so we're going to move to page 2. Hopefully I'm working not too fast. Let me know in the chat or how the pace is going. I am trying to keep it nice, relaxed, fun. So we mentioned light direction. So we're going to do 2 exercises, 2 drawings on this same page. And these are, again, kind of a reference that you can always look back to. We're going to start with a simple circle. So remember, we're going to do 2 of them on this page. So I'm going to leave a little space between them. And I'm going to make it just a little bit bigger than the previous. And I'm going to just slowly kind of ghost a circle. And if you were in the previous class, we know how to do this. Until you have a sketch that you could then draw. And we can actually look at these edges and incorporate them into our drawing. But what I'm doing is I'm starting very, very lightly, light touches of the pencil to the paper. And as I confirm my shape, I can make those lines a little bit darker, but not too dark. We want to kind of have a foundation that we could build on, that if not working at all, not that you would have to, you could erase if you wanted to. So as soon as you make those really dark lines, you're not going to be able to erase them as easy. So the lighter you start, and you can actually see that it's working, then you can try not to get too tight and make those marks stay loose all the way through. And you'll have better results. Here, to this circle, to this shape, I'm going to add. And for this one, we're going to actually draw them there. So what I'm looking at is 2 parallel lines, and they're kind of parallel, that are streaming down and touch the very edge of our shape. So I have one like this, and I have the second one coming in right here. Again, I'm doing very light lines, and I'm just moving my full range, not just my wrist. My elbow is off the table. My shoulder is the one dictating movement. My wrist is locked, but I could be using just elbow wrist. So being aware of your range of motion here, very crucial. So what this represents is the light. So we have the light direction. And the light direction is going to fall on our object here, on our shape. And it's going to create this. As light travels, it travels in straight lines. In this case, they're a little more parallel. Where the light meets the edges of our shape, we want to make a little tiny mark. Now, really pinpoint where the first place light touches your subject is. And I have a point right here, and I have one point right here. And then I'm going to connect. And I'm using a straight line here. We're going to call that the Terminator, and I'll show you why. Next, wherever my surface is, those same lines are going to pinpoint how my object, my shape, is blocking light, giving me the point for, in this case, right here, and let's say right here, my cast shadow. So all I have to do is connect with an ellipse those 2 points. If you can see that, notice how it starts coming together. And it is amazing how our brain just begins to interpret and see it for what it is, at what stage it's working. And the less is more formula always works, where if we could get away with this and it makes sense, we should stop there. So now we're just going to use that technique. And what I want you to do is consider all of this from that line, which we call the Terminator, which is where the light touches the edges of your subject, your shape, and the cast shadow. I'm going to consider those as one, just as one shape. So if I could fill this in, I have 2 shapes on screen now. I have the light shape, and I have the shadow shape. So all of this is one shape. Now, when we begin drawing, we're going to see shifts. Reflective light, darker areas of the shadow, and we're going to actually, play with that. But for now, we want to just stop there. And if I were to add, let's say, another element to this, a horizon, I immediately could begin to see not just the shape, not the location of the shape in space, but I can also identify the light direction, the light source, and also the light distance. So let's see if that makes a little more sense with this next one. And again, this is building up to a crescendo. So next one, we're going to also start with a circle. And I'm going to place this one a little more to the right than the middle. You'll see why. I'm going to make it a little bit, trying to match the size. Again, I'm starting very light, ghosting my shape. And as I see it form and I'm happy with it, I begin to darken some of these marks by just adding a little more pressure as I move through the shape. And there we have it. I can make subtle corrections at different points of it to round it up a little more. But the key here is to stay loose, to find a way to make this very smooth by being loose and not getting really tight and trying to just trace a circle. This time we're going to add 2 lines from a source. So I'm going to place a point right here. That's going to be our light source. And from that point, I'm going to draw 2 lines that once again are going to touch one edge at the top And I'm going to continue that line all the way through. And from that same point to the bottom here. So right now I'm looking at this shape as a two-dimensional shape. And I'm just considering top and bottom. But we should also consider that it has left and right edges if it's three-dimensional. So a front and a back is what I mean. For now, we just worry about top and bottom and how that light source and the light direction interacts with our shape. Now, what is the next step? I'll let you think about it for a second. If you remember, yep, it's that. And I combined them here. So from this point to this point, which is where the light touches the edges of our shape, I'm going to make, notice that this line I made just a little more curve because of the way the light is rolling and it is closer. So I'm just going to, instead of a straight line, I'm going to give it a little curve. And next, I am going to figure out where my surface is. So let's call it right here. And where this light touches my surface, that's my first point. And if I continue all the way here, it would touch all the way out here. Now this is the tricky part. Obviously in my slide here, we have a cut-off shape. I have to rework that. And the key here is going to create an ellipse that contains, it touches these 2 points. Now it's going to be a little bit flatter type of ellipse, not too round. Otherwise that would give us a different light logic as to where our light direction or our light distance is. And it just rounds right at this edge as well. So if we have this so far and it makes sense visually, and it does, it begins to actually say, oh, I get it. Now the light, as the light angle in the light direction lowers into our object, it makes perfect sense that our shadow would be cast. So think about those afternoon or early morning shadows where you see your own shadow and you're like 12 feet tall. But instead at noon, sometimes you're like, where's my shadow? You have to lift your feet to actually see it because it's just pinpoint. So it is that, understanding light direction, light distance, and what it does to our objects. So here, we're going to use the same approach, and we're going to unite into one solid shape all of our shadow. And here I'm going with one of two methods. You could continue adding the lines in the direction of the light, which if you notice, they're not parallel anymore. They're coming from one source. So because it's closer, we could see the angle of it. If this light were closer, think about that experiment for a second. If, let's do it right here. You don't have to do this, but if the light, and I have my circle here, if the light were this close, I'm going to zoom in real quick so you can see this. So it really, really makes sense. So if my light was this source, obviously my angles are going to be way wider. And my points at the surface are going to be way closer. So all of this is going to be in shadow. Identifying light direction, light distance, light angles, unifying your shadow shape, and you're identifying your light shape and your shadow shape as one. And from here you have the basis to then apply to any form. And the reason we're working with the simplest forms today is because if you have not mastered that one yet, we need to go back and figure out why. Okay, so for the first, let's see, we have, there it is, our shape unified in one light shape and shadow shape. So we're going to move to the next page. And if you needed to label anything in this page, it would be light direction. Some of the other terminology, as I mentioned here, this would be your Terminator, where your light and shadow meet. And it's, you identify it when you look at the moon. It's the same one here. And then the other one would be your cast shadow. Just to add one more, this is your form shadow. And again, do not worry about these so much, about knowing what their names are or the terms. It's understanding them that makes the difference. Added bonus, yeah, okay, I know what a cast shadow is. I know what the difference between a cast shadow and a form shadow is. But do I understand them? That's the key. So the idea would be to hopefully focus on the one on top, but have the second one as your goal. If you're anywhere near there, perfect. Obviously, as this exercise moves along, the idea is to begin to add more values, meaning from white to black, everything in between, all those grays, we're going to want to resemble that light interaction with our shape. So I'm going to start with, this one's going to be a little bit bigger. Now, we have about an hour left, 50 minutes left. If you make this way too big, you might run into time trouble. Because a drawing like this could literally take us 2 hours, 4 hours. I've seen artists that could take weeks because of the type of approach that they do. Now, if you're working really fast, yeah, you might want to make it big, a little bit bigger. But here I suggest make it medium size, fill up your page, consider the shadow, consider the edge. So I'm going to place it just a little bit off center, just a little bit above. And I'm going to consider, number one, the size on my page as I ghost it. And I'm using a very light, my lightest pencil. In this case, an HB. And I'm using it very, very light so I could ghost it. You could barely see it. And that's what you want. You want to identify your shape. In this case, you want this to be your superstar. This is your main attraction here. So you want it to look like a circle. Like I said, it's fine as practice. If it's just a little bit off, it's great practice to just fill up pages with some of these gestures. And you do not want to, one of the things I want to touch on today is this. You do not want to identify the edges of your shape by always drawing a hard line around it. One of the things I wanted to show you is I could begin to develop this circle. I'm going to zoom in just a little bit so you can see this. Instead of me drawing, and I think this is very important if you want to see it for about 30 seconds. Just pause where you are and look at this. Instead of me wanting to harshly draw a outline of a circle, eventually it'll take time, but I'm going to rush through it just a little bit here. I could identify my shape by creating a different value. No lines, technically no outline between my background and my subject. So I could begin to identify the difference in light treatment between the background. And again, I'm looking at my reference photo. So my background is darker than my subject. And if my subject were darker than my background, I would be doing the opposite. I would be shading my subject to differentiate from the background. But notice how the line or the outline begins to come together without me having to draw an actual line to delineate that circle shape. You could do it in this way, and this is the way you get to more realistic rendering. Because when we draw portraits, for example, and this is what we're looking at, this simplistic approach to apply it to whether it's landscapes, portraits, animal portraits, you name it, still lifes. Well, this is technically a still life. When we draw, for example, a nose or a mouth, we tend to draw those outlines. Oh, the lips, that's where they start, that's where they end. And we do these lines that we then try to treat light into. But we don't see that in life, really. Technically, there are no edges. When you look at a subject, there's just the difference between subject and background, or what it's called juxtaposition. And here, I develop my circle by actually adding value to the background. And this is just the first stage. I could spend several minutes here. And the key words for this exercise are going to be observation. So closely observing with what you know now, not having to draw those lines. And I'm talking about, zoom out just a little bit. I'm talking about these lines here that then point to the cast, shadow, and blah, blah, blah. We understand them now. If you want to identify them, you could still visualize them. If you have to, yeah, you could really just lightly put just a pencil mark there. But I could begin to see where the previous exercises that we did, the setups for these, begin to work for me. There's my Terminator. And from here, I could just begin to add layers. In this case, I'm following the direction of the light with the first light layer. So we're working from very light to darker each step of the way. Excuse me. From here, I want to also identify the direction of the light that would place me right about here and right about here. And I could just, again, very lightly sketch that in. Very loosely. And repeat the process that we did earlier, which is unifying our shadow shapes. Now, the lighter you stay at this early stage, the more payoff you're going to get at the end. Because you're going to be able to build slowly, slower into a more realistic value scale. One thing I noticed here, see, this is the great thing. If I make them light, I think this is a little too wide, a little too far from my shape. So I'm going to erase just a little bit. Reevaluate as I look at my reference photo. And I see that this cast shadow was a little too wide. And it actually starts thinner here. And it widens a little later. More like this. So there's observation. So observation, key for this exercise. Number 2 would be becoming aware of your pace. Is your pace really fast? If it's a little bit slower, it could be something. There is such a thing as too slow. So whatever the comfort and effectiveness, efficiency of your pace, to become aware of it, where you, in a way, it's kind of becoming aware of your patience level, where your pace is maintained in order to get the best results. And just a more fun experience from analyzing light on a simple form. So number 1, observation. Number 2, pace. Number 3, pressure. If you notice, my pencil, I got to replace it. It's becoming shorter and shorter. But I grab it all the way at the end. And I grab it with a grip that's called the overhand grip, which is, I place my pencil, we might have talked about this last time, I place it on my index and middle finger, and then I just, with my thumb, hold it like this. And with this motion, I have a way larger range of motion. With this grip, I have a larger range of motion just by moving my wrist, my elbow, my shoulder. If I were to grab my pencil like this, I'm only using my fingers. And this is how we were taught to write. So this grip is for writing. You do not want to draw with this grip. I know at the beginning, it's like riding a bicycle for the first time. If you go with this grip, you're like, I can't, I'm going to fall. Well, it takes practice. But the more and more, you'll find yourself at the Tour de France eventually. When it comes to riding a bicycle, that's what you want to do. You just want to practice your grip, your range of motion. But with this grip, the key thing is I could manage my pressure. So with the same grip, I'm going to show you down here what I could do. I could do a line that you barely could see. And I could just, by squeezing my thumb and my index finger, I could begin to apply levels of pressure that are easily identifiable. You see that? So I could take this from a, you don't even see it, which is just barely almost the weight of the pencil on the paper, to a pressure where I could almost feel like I'm going to break the tip of the pencil. And this is what you want. This kind of control eventually, where here we want to be at the very lightest pressure as I just layer my graphite onto the paper. And I mentioned we have pencil kits. So I'm using an HB right now, which is a lighter, harder pencil. And as I move along in the stages of this drawing, I'm going to begin to add a darker, softer pencil. So I'll move from an HB to a 2B to a 4B and then finish with the 6B. And that might be just for the tiny little finishing touches of the darkest areas. So I'm just expanding the background a little more, making it a little more picture-like, framing it, going all the way to the edge. And notice the range of motion with my grip. I'm staying very light. I don't want to go too dark too fast. And I'm using somewhat of a just coverage type of hatching. So the lines are vertical, up and down in one direction. It's going to give it a little more consistency. If I'm adding lines in every direction, it's going to get busy. So you want some of the lines to consistently match in value, in coverage, and you'll get a much more unified, harmonious type of look in your drawing. Therefore, more realistic as well. So as I get closer to my edges of my shape, I get a little more slower pace, more controlled. Now, as I do detail such as this, you might consider grabbing it with the same grip, but a little bit shorter. And obviously you begin to do more of a finger control, because the closer you get to the tip, the more control over the tip you have, but the less pressure control you have. So you have to really hold it softer. And again, it's all a matter of testing. All the different strokes that I'm talking about today. But once again, pace, pressure, absolutely key. And just to think about them, if I were to say right now, are you aware of your pressure? And if your fingers are hurting, that's a bad sign, because we're pressing too hard. You should feel like literally the weight of the pencil on the paper at all times. And what that does too is there's a thing with the paper and the grain, the tooth of the paper, the texture of the paper. The harder you press on it, you can literally rip through it. So what I want to do here, what I want you to feel here is, I'm going to show you hopefully a little bit closer. I'm actually painting the graphite right onto the paper, and I could see it. So if you've ever done a drawing in pencil, so graphite, and then it starts getting really shiny, what's happening there is you're not laying graphite on paper anymore. You're laying graphite on top of graphite. And when you lay graphite on top of graphite, that's when you get that shiny look. Because graphite, they used to call it lead because they thought that's what it was. It gets that metallic look. You want to feel like you're still layering on the texture of the paper all the way through the end. That's going to give you absolutely more satisfaction, and you'll feel under control. But the harder you press on the paper with your pencil, the more you're going to affect the tooth of the paper, the harder it's going to be for the paper to grab onto the next layer of graphite. So you find yourself layering graphite on top of graphite. And then you lose that feel, that nice, beautiful graphite pencil on paper type look. And I'm not saying it's wrong. If that's the look you need to go for, that shiny, heavy graphite look, then fine, you're aware of it. I'm going to add one horizontal line here. Should be a little bit lower than my Terminator. And I'm just going to blend them in because I'm kind of shifting my body position so these lines become a little more precise as I get closer to a straight edge. And again, it's all about practice. How do we fill in a space with graphite that ends in a sharp edge? Well, I'm just coming to the close, or I could start from it and pull away from it like this. It takes a little longer, a little more practice, but eventually you become automatic. Me, I like to go up and down, and what I focus on is the control between the space of each one of my lines. So I'm trying to lay down my line right on top of the last one. And just moving along very slowly as I can see the space between the lines, the paper, and I just slowly cover it in graphite, being aware of how dark my value needs to be. So right now I'm still very light, very, very light as possible. But slowly as I go over it, you can begin to see how this is getting a little bit darker. So let's call this a value number. Usually values, and this is very helpful, I always mention and recommend it for drawing and painting, to have one of these, your grayscale value finder. So black, 100% black would be value 1. And we will get there somewhere. And most likely it'll be right about here, in here, somewhere. But it's going to be a little bit, and that's going to be here. And then as we move down these values into lighter and lighter, all the way up to 100% white, or light. In this case, the white of the paper, which is value 10. And that's going to be right here, where our highlight is, where the contact of direct light shows us the direction of the light. And that's going to be, like I said, just the white of the paper. So it's going to be the ultra lightest area. Everything else, we're wanting to add different variations of it. So my background, most likely I would put somewhere around about here. My shadows and cast shadows would probably be between here and here. Maybe here for the form, for the what we called earlier the form shadow. And my cast shadow would definitely be between here and here. But for the most part, we're dealing with a lot of these variations from here to here. And like I said, early on with the image at the bottom, you could just work here and here. These two. The white and black. I'm slowly trying to build that background into what I would call a value 3 or 4. So 4 steps away from black and about 6 steps away from white. That's one good way of thinking about it. Now there are other things to consider. Say that again, I'm sorry? Let's see. I couldn't hear you. There, you're breaking up. Oh, Like, are you saying smudging? Yes. Okay, that's a great question. And I can't see. I'll give you one big tip that I have. Um, Excellent question. So, as I work on my graphite, when I'm working on this area here, if I lay down or lean my hand on my drawing, we're going to smudge it. So, one way, easy way is don't lean your hand. So, I'm anchoring my elbow. My hand is off my paper the entire time. If I need to, I lean my elbow. So, my elbow is my anchor point, and because of the grip I use, I don't need to lean my hand. That's one way. Another way, you want to start, if you're right handed, you want to start at the top left and make this a usual practice because you could lean it on your hand. You can lean your hand on white paper as you work from top left to bottom right. So you could work from top left to top right and work your way down from bottom left to bottom right. That way you're never smudging. There's no work done here. And then the other way, which a lot of artists are using, is you simply, I just grab a piece of paper here. You would place a separate sheet of paper here. So this is just a loose piece of paper. Tracing paper works the best. There's different types of vellum papers and somewhat like waxy papers that you could lean on, so you could lean your hand on it. So it's the grease, the oils in your hand that smudge. With the paper, it can move. It'll smudge just a little bit depending on how soft your graphite, the graphite you're using. So a softer, darker pencil is going to smudge way more than a lighter pencil. And I'm still with an HB. So even this motion here probably won't smudge as much. But to have this piece of paper here to lean your hand, if you have to lean your hand, is the best solution. And you move it as you need to move your hand. So you can move it up here. And it should be a larger piece. And when you're done, said and done, you notice that, yeah, it'll rub off a little. I'm doing it on purpose here. But it's minimal. It's minimal. You barely see anything here. And those are 3 ways. You're very welcome. And it is a great question. And eventually, you come to discover all of your personal methods, your personal techniques, what works best for you. And that's the goal. I'm just showing you somewhat popular techniques, skills of exercises that you have to discover. When you focus on the few things that I mentioned today, how you draw a line, and you could spend months analyzing and studying all the different individual types of lines that you can draw with different pressure, with different gauge, with different methods, with different mediums, on different papers, for different subjects, how it affects. But you're looking at pace, you're looking at pressure, and overall, the most important thing, observation. How you're seeing what's on screen or your reference photo or from life, and making interpretations to apply your methods, your techniques, your skills, and transfer that onto paper. For me, the 2 biggest ones are that, pace and pressure. When it comes to drawing, that's it. Obviously, like I said, observation is the one and biggest thing. And your understanding of what's going on. In this case, understanding of the shape, understanding of the form, and even a little further, understanding of what light is doing to that form. Okay, so I'm pretty close to finish with this pencil, which is my HB. I'm going to see if I can add a little bit more right into here. So I'm using 1 stroke, and all of them are just in that kind of light direction. They're way lighter. So I would call this a value 8 or 9, getting very close to that value 10, which is pure light, which is going to be that paper, the white of the paper here. And I'm just applying one very light coat in the white shape, light shape, as I finish up with this pencil. And this is just one great way to kind of set yourself up. I call it setting up for success. Once you have this developed far enough, you can move on to the next stage. But even here, you could still make rearrangements, reassessments, and corrections. And there we have it. So I'm very, very patient, maintaining my pace, my direction, having that nice soft pressure all the way through. And I use a word that I'm going to use now, which is caressing. Who doesn't love caressing? And this is caressing the paper. And you have to feel like, I know we prefer being the caressed, in my case, than doing the caressing, but it's fun when you could just have that feeling and really just, in a way, it's kind of becoming intimate with the graphite and the paper and what's going on in this moment. It is about caressing it and maintaining pace, pressure to deliver the absolute best rendition of light and shadow. So it always comes to mind, and it does help to think about it that way. You want to kind of love the paper and caress it all the way through. So it takes patience. You realize how much pressure and how much patience and in the end, you will see the rewards. So there's a thing I was mentioning here where we have the light coming from this direction, and it is going right through our cast shadow, creating this shape here. We have light shape, shadow shape. But if you look right here, we have a light surface that is bouncing light, reflected light, back into our shadow. So when we look here, we have our Terminator, where a dark stripe of shadow then starts becoming a little bit brighter again, a little bit lighter. That's part of your observation. So one of those exercises that I've mentioned before, it's also becoming very familiar, not just with light, but it's also more about becoming familiar with shadows. So one thing I bring up is, have you ever been in the dark? And I'm talking about complete, absolute dark. Like you wake up one day, 2, 3 in the morning, and you have to go, no night lights, no clock lights, or, these Wi-Fi lights all over the place. And it's absolutely dark. You realize that if you open your eyes and you're staring at the dark, it only takes a few minutes for the shadows to begin to reveal themselves. And there's light everywhere, even in the shadows. And the forms begin to pop up. And you begin to recognize, and you're within 15 minutes absolutely comfortable in the dark. And it's the way your eyes adapt to it. They just, have to become accustomed so they could see. But there is light in the shadows. And it's the same thing here. Really becoming aware of everything that's going in the shadows and allowing your eyes to adjust by observing. It's really all about observation without rushing, without making up information, because we think we know, oh yeah, it's a ball in a shadow. And there you go. I could just make up my own information by skipping that crucial step of observing and interpreting. So I'm leaving a little bit of a stripe here of lighter value before I move on to my one step darker pencil. So I'm done with my HB for now. I'm going to move to my 2B pencil. So it's just one step above. One of my recommendations, always, remember to use a sharp pencil. Sharp pencils are your best friend. You will have much, much more absolute finer control over the tip and the way you lay down the graphite. So immediately you could see the shift from an HB to a 2B with the same exact pressure. I feel like I have to lighten my pressure even more. But can you see how immediately it becomes darker without effort? So that layer that I put down earlier with the HB, it's paying off already. I have to minimize my work and it becomes more efficient. It becomes easier. It's not harder work. It's easier for me to really observe, and very easily, very lightly, with less pressure, begin to add darker values to some of these shapes. I'm talking about shadow shapes. Light shadow shapes within the shadow, if that makes any sense. And not to rush, because I know this is supposed to be darker eventually, but I don't want to just skip all the steps and make this the darkest to be by just pressuring the graphite on there. I want to layer it. And my goal today is to work from 2B, where we're right now, all the way up to 8B. So it's going to be 2B, 4B, 6B, 8B. And just creating one quick layer in my cast shadow, very light. And it just becomes so rich when you could still see some of that texture of the paper, meaning you caressed it so finely that it still responds when you're adding 8B or the 4th, 5th step of graphite. And if this is not your style of drawing, like, oh, this is too boring, like it's too slow, I like to work more gestural, more, expressionist, or more faster, in other words. I think it is always a great exercise in self study to test yourself with the things that probably annoy you. It's like trying broccoli a kid trying broccoli for the first time. Everybody tells me it's good for you, and I don't believe, but it doesn't. I don't like. I don't think there's a vegetable I love more than broccoli now. When you really find that beauty or the deliciousness that's in it, same with this. It's, can you discover something about yourself in this technique, in this exercise of observation and pace and pressure? I am so sorry. I can hear you, but you're breaking up. So I'm catching like a third of your question. Is that happening to everybody? Can you hear okay? Can you repeat the question? Because you are breaking up like every 3, 4 words. So it's something about if you want to work faster with more pressure or in color. I hope, yeah, I hope you're, let's see if you could type it in the chat. Okay, if we use color, let's see where to go. There we are. If we use color, then do we use color from the spectrum from light blue to dark blue? Yeah. Well, when you deal with color and shadows, there's something about color theory. Yes, the logic would be you would start with white into blue, light, very light blues, into darker blues, into your darkest blues. But when you work with color and color theory, the way to develop your shadows in color is by using the complementary color. So if you're using blues and you want realistic shadows, you're going to introduce some orange in there. And you'll see that usually it becomes somewhat of a brown or a gray or a dark gray that you then add more blue to it. And then you begin to play with the cool or warm temperatures of that shadow. So the more orange it is, the warmer it is. The bluer it is, then the cooler it is. And it is a little dance, a little balance of pushing from one complementary color to the other. Most people would generally just go to black, and that is one way. You could always... but when you add black to a color, you're adding what's called a shade, not the actual complementary shadow color of it. And the reason that happens is when you work with blue and you introduce orange, which is the complementary, you're introducing the other two primaries, yellow and red. That's what makes orange. So you're mixing a ratio of all three colors. And when you mix all three colors, you get black. So it makes sense to mix the complementary color. And again, it's this technique. If you're working, let's say, with color pencil, I would recommend, yes, testing it. Maybe on a separate paper before you actually put it on your piece. And maybe do it both ways. Mixing it from lightest blue to darkest blue to then add some black into your blue. But also by adding, ideally, the opposite color in the color wheel complementary to it. So if you have a greener blue or redder blue, you want to make sure you find the right orange that is opposite. So a yellower orange or a redder orange might make a big difference. Does that make any sense? But even when you work with color a lot, these exercises that we're doing here make your painting, drawing in color, and all other facets so much stronger. Because you realize that eventually it's not about color. You can get away with pink, green, purple faces, portraits. If your values, if your light and shadow work is properly done, you get away with any color. And within those values of that color, you have success if you're working this approach. Better than even understanding color. It's values that makes the big difference. So I'm going to add a little more of this. Still with a 2B. So notice that I just added little patches. And what I do is I'm looking at my reference photo and I squint. If you really, really squint at it so hard you're almost looking through your eyelashes, all you begin to see is a blurred shape. But notice how easy it is to identify light and shadow. The harder you squint, and you see a lot of artists squinting, the harder they squint, the more it reveals itself. So notice if you squint, how that reflected light in the shadow just, whoa, becomes alive. And you actually see it. So it's observing it, seeing it, and then interpreting. I'm about to give you the biggest thing of the day today, which is sometimes a little confusing. And even if I say it, it won't make sense until you try it out for yourself. And what is that? We have light. We have shadows. Now, the darkest value in your light as compared to the lightest value in your shadow. When you compare those two, your lightest value in your shadow is still always darker than your darkest value in the light. Let me repeat that again. Your lightest value in your shadow shape is always going to be darker than the darkest value in your light shape. Does that make sense? I know these are words like right now, like, wait, what? Doesn't make sense. All it means is if I find light, reflected light here in my shadow area, remember the early exercises where we had just a line and we divided light shape, shadow shape. Everything that's in my shadow shape, even if it's the lightest thing right here, for example, I see very light areas, it's still in my shadow shape. So this lightest area in my shadow shape still has to be darker than, let's say here, the darkest value in my light shape. And it should be kind of intuitive, and it is the ultimate thing you need to understand. That all the light dark values in the light are always going to be lighter than the lightest parts of your shadow. So it is crucial as we begin to develop more and more of the darker. I want to see, for example, the background begin to really push and separate from the form. As I continue reading, what is pretty much the hardest part of rendering light and shadow, which is how these two interact. Because we have light, shadow, and then we have a thing called mid-tones. Now your mid-tones tend to be still in the light. That's why they are mid, because the light still hits them. If light was not hitting them, they would be in the shadow. So how light and how dark are these midtones? Usually they're very soft, they're very narrow. If you look at, for example, a cube with a sharp edge, you could easily see where the light just drops from one side to the other. So you have no midtones there. But when we work with shapes like a sphere, there's just continuous smooth surface where the light just rolls. And to draw and to render that type of value change is really tricky. So it is the focus of it, the midtones. Just finding that perfect middle range. That shows you that gradual transition. So the way I did it here, I did that, remember that one full pass from the shadow, the second, and then I added a third, way smaller little stripe of HB. I'm kind of going over that with even smaller strokes, way less pressure. Let me show it over here in a way kind of like this. So this was my first one. And I'm making it darker just so you can see. The second one, I went a little bit smaller, but a little bit above that first one. And now my third one, I'm going even a little bit further up, but smaller lines. So I'm kind of uniting these three passes by just tripling the lines, by making the first one long, the second one medium, the third one smaller. But because the third one's smaller and darker, it's going to add that little effect that I like. And again, this is all you and the way you develop your technique. What works for you is not necessarily what works for me. It's all about your pace, your pressure, and in a way, your strategy. Because my strategy is trying to build this up from very, very light, as you saw early on, little by little to darker and darker. And I'm just adding a little extra on the edges. Remember, I never drew a line, technically, that outline of my circle. I'm just really making sure that we don't see an edge. A line would actually make sense here on the edge of the table. And I could actually make that not necessarily a line, but just a couple of harder passes of darker value instead of a harsh line here. So adapting all of these different pencil markings, all of the different types of lines. For the most part, I've been working with verticals and a couple of diagonals. I'm going to add some horizontal. So notice that here I shift my paper pad so I could continue working almost in diagonals, because to me, that's my hardest stroke, horizontals. I have to kind of if I kept my paper the same way, I have to rearrange my body position to adjust for those actual horizontal lines that I want control over. I'm ready to move to the next pencil. And we'll see a big shift here, going from 2B to 4B. Again, squinting. Really taking a couple of seconds looking at it. Just like that thing I mentioned earlier about being in the dark and letting your eyes adjust and really take it in, really begin to see. Very slowly, remind myself to be patient. Notice how long I'm grabbing this pencil all the way at the end. And it does take a little bit of practice, but you can do it. And these are the types of exercises that you want to practice that with. Because as my pencil gets darker, it gets a lot easier to just add a little tiny pressure and jump that value scale. So I want to just notice immediately you see the contrast between a 2B and a 4B with the same exact type of pressure. So it's that I want you to kind of get a sense of, oh my gosh, I could imagine if I added a little more pressure. The opposite. Imagine what you can do with control over the lightest pressure all the way through. And the difference, if you notice, I could still see the texture of the paper as I add my graphite here. Let me switch over really quick, show you that. Hopefully very close so you could see it. And it is, you could still see some texture showing through. The beauty of the different types of papers, some of them very expensive. The finer papers that you work with, you want to maintain that all the way through, where once it's framed and you look at it through the glass, you could still see the beauty of, oh my gosh, look at that painting of graphite on the texture of the paper. And here you could still see that. And I'm going to just do something crazy here, as opposed to getting shiny right away. So notice that I'm putting pressure at the tip. So now, depending on the way you see the light, there's no way for me to read what kind of texture did this paper have here. And the bigger I make that area, notice here you can still see some texture, but as I add pressure to it, it's like I'm drawing on plastic almost. Because now you're just laying graphite on top of graphite, and you get that shiny. See, there it is right there. Once you angle it to the light, you begin to get that shiny effect, where you kind of lost all the texture of the paper. So that is, I think, my biggest tip of the day. Avoid, and you can get this dark, believe it or not, with patience, by just layering. Remember, I'm still at a 4B. And we're reaching almost a level of darkness. And I'm actually going to the cast shadow because it still stands out as the darkest. And I'm not going to have to add much here. I'm just going to begin to shift a little bit the rolling. So I'm doing more circular motions. Notice here, instead of that linear type of line that I was doing earlier, I'm beginning to see the form come together. So I feel like I'm rubbing my pencil on an actual three-dimensional object. So it's going away from me, towards me, in that round kind of sensation, not just flat, up and down, up and down. Although you could still work it, this circular motion I feel really works, especially for portraits when you work with that light on all the subtle different forms of, cheekbones, nose, lips. You want more of the circular motion that will identify that gradual shift of planes, round planes on the face. But it works for pretty much any type of drawing, really. At some point, it becomes something that's called scumbling. But I'm trying to keep I'm thinking of the letter O, lots of little O's. Sometimes they become figure eights. And notice that I'm just giving slower, very light pressure passes over some of the same areas, but I contain and saturate as I observe, because most of the time I'm looking not at my paper, but at my reference photo. And I really want to, and again, I take my eyes off of it for a second, and I come back to my reference photo, but I'm actually trying to really interpret what I actually see. And that's the only way you're going to get close to capturing likeness from a subject. I'm going to move over to a 6B. And I'm going to start finishing up a little bit of this line here. Some of my, again, pressure still the same. I'm just giving layer. In this case, it's almost like a third or fourth layer already. So it becomes more and more accurate. I could really begin to narrow what I call here that edge. Really giving the shape a nice, neat, clean juxtaposition over the background. And as I work all the way around, again, looking at my reference, making sure some of these areas become way darker, adding a little more pressure, a little more saturation, identifying the light in the background, which is crucial, and how it just immediately rearranges the space. It makes us see the space, the distance between our subject and the background. Now, one more thing. If there's any areas where you need to bring in an eraser, the idea is not for you to erase, but to draw with it. So just as you were drawing darker values, if you bring in an eraser, you want to feel like you're drawing light values. So I'm kind of using some of those same line patterns that I was doing all the way through, where you would see a little bit of that hatching, even with the eraser, over some of those layers of graphite. Having one of these is always great when you use an eraser. It's like a little brush to just, so you don't use your fingers and smudge. Going down into the darker area with the 6B. Again, shifting the pressure just a little bit, But not much of a coverage because of all the layers that are done there. just giving a second pass almost. I want to make this just a little bit more or sharper, with the sharper edge. And it's fine if you see some of the lines. Our drawing does not have to be completely, smooth and blended in. The idea is with your pencil strokes to do that, but you could still see all the line work on this one, where it makes it look interesting. So for my final pass, I'm going to go to the 8B. And I'm really just going, again, same pressure. This is the moment where you really become the most patient, because at this moment you could really just take it to the other side, which is what I've been talking about all morning, and make it shiny. So you're really careful to not lay graphite on top of graphite here with pressure. This is such a soft pencil. It should just glide over and add that little extra darkness. And these are the moments where you should be very careful. You're almost finished. It's where you should really pace yourself. Sometimes we kind of get hungry, get tired, and we just rush to finish. And that's the danger moment when you're almost there, and you should be the most careful, and we rush it. So we, in a way, kind of hurt all that work we've done early on. And again, I'm just touching on certain little areas, going over the layers that I had before. Switching over to my 2B. And all it needs is a signature now. And there we have it. Now, as I mentioned, if you have one of these, this is a kneaded eraser. These are great tools to actually shape it. You could actually make it very, very sharp point, and you could actually draw little strokes. And it's just actually lifting some of that graphite. You have to be very careful because it also works with pace and pressure. For some of these reflected light areas, it is your best friend, your best tool here. So you don't want to smudge it, you don't want to rub it. What I'm doing is tapping it, and it just lifts tiny little amounts of graphite. But at the same time, it allows me to go back over it if I need to, as opposed to if I rub my finger, excuse me, or any other blending tool that will smooth out the paper, taking out a little bit of that texture. This actually helps it. And there we have it. That is understanding the basics. I hope you had fun.